Arguably, the Philippines is an exceptional country. It's exceptional in many ways, including in terms of its foreign policy. Close to 10 million Filipinos have been working all around the world in recent decades, and their contributions have been essential to our economy, close to 10% of our gross domestic product. Accordingly, we have quite a unique foreign policy doctrine. Aside from defending our national interests in traditional diplomatic terms, and aside from promoting our economic interests, one of the pillars of our foreign policy is the protection of the overseas Filipino workers. And this is also a region that has been victim of different kinds of conflicts, including the latest conflict in Gaza. Today we have a very special guest who will help us understand the challenges facing our country and how we're trying our best to protect overseas Filipinos, especially amid the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. Joining us tonight is Foreign Affairs Undersecretary for Migrant Workers Affairs and Ambassador Eduardo de Vega. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening. And wow, you pronounce my name the Spanish way, yeah?
Yeah, which I think is something we'll have to go back later on to. Let's start first of all with your position, your particular position. What is this Undersecretary position for Migrant Workers Affairs, and how unique is this to the Philippines?
Well, first of all, this was an offshoot of the Flor Contemplacion case in 1995. If you remember, the Singaporeans executed a Filipina who was convicted of murder, and there was a general outcry that the Foreign Service hadn't done enough to protect her. So it gave rise to migration protection as an important pillar of our foreign policy, and it created this position originally called the Legal Assistant for Migrant Workers Affairs, which eventually evolved to the Undersecretary for Migrant Workers Affairs. So we actually preceded the Department of Migrant Workers, which is a new department, and some people get confused and think that I'm part of that new department. But no, I'm still with the DFA. I am with the DFA, and that's because even as we're transitioning towards a new department, the Philippines will continue the Philippine Foreign Service, will continue to promote migration protection. So that position has to remain. We could, for purposes of not confusing people, we could change the name perhaps to one day to Undersecretary for Migration Policy, so that the public will not be confused. We have a 2-year transition period, which started in 2022 February. And it's supposed to be that within 2 years, ideally, we shall have turned over most of the functions, but not all, because we will continue to have a role, one, in countries where there's no labor or now migrant workers attaches, and number two, for overseas Filipinos who are not contract workers but may fall under different categories like immigrants, dual citizens, tourists. So that will still be the DFA doing it. Why is it unique? I'm not sure that we have too many countries where migration protection is such an important part of
pillar of our foreign policy.
Foreign policy. That's something that we are credited for. Like we have set the gold standard for migration protection, as we always hear. So it's quite an honor for the Philippines or any Philippine diplomat to continue that tradition.
Ambassador, are you looking towards some sort of complementarity as this bureaucratic transition happens, as a new whole department for migrant affairs comes into being?
Yes.
Considering how, we're talking about, 10 million Filipinos perhaps abroad?
Yes.
And a lot of them in legal limbo, for that matter, to put it mildly. So this is a huge mandate, right?
It's a huge mandate, but we are working with the DMW before with late Secretary Tutsople and now with OIC Hans Kakdak in setting the parameters. I'll give you an example. In the Middle East now, we have already transitioned to them taking the major role in protecting our workers because they're OFWs in the Middle East. And there are migrant workers attaches in each country in the Middle East.
Exactly.
We have 90 embassies and consulates and only about 36 or so migrant workers attaches. So there's still a lot of work that we do. And it has to be complementary. After all, even the migrant workers attaches work under the one country team approach, meaning they have to be under the general command.
So it's a
of the
consolidated.
Yes, it's a consolidated thing, and after all, it's a work in progress, and we want them to succeed. We want the new department to succeed completely, because the Foreign Service may need to focus a bit more back on the traditional elements of foreign policy, such as political diplomacy, economic diplomacy efforts, cultural promotion. Because, for example, in the Middle East, most of the work that our embassies do, along with their attachés, is protection of nationals. It's important. But now with the growing trend in the Middle Eastern countries to modernize and remodel themselves, redefine themselves, I'm looking for the right term, then we should also promote other elements of our relationship other than just migration.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm asking is this, for instance, in Australia, they have DFAT, right? So both trade and traditional political diplomacy go together. And as you correctly pointed out, there's also a big transition happening in the Gulf region. I mean, let's not forget the whole labor exporting phenomenon had something to do with the construction boom in the Middle East in the 1970s. In fact, people forget there were also hundreds of thousands of South Koreans and other Asian nationals who are now, developed countries who were there, but eventually they moved on. And perhaps the idea also here is at some point the Philippines, as we are now a middle-income country, we're moving towards an upper middle-income country. Perhaps there could be also some major reconfiguration, perhaps, in terms of our relationship with these major destinations for labor export, right? I mean, the reason I'm saying this is because just a few months ago, our NEDA secretary was in the Middle East, and he said something like, much more known yung Thailand and Vietnam for investment destination for Gulf Arab countries. So have a lot of capital to dispense with, and they want to go global. But pagdating sa Pilipinas, parang we're under acknowledged, or perhaps we're not as much appreciated for the economic potentials we have. Which makes me think, baka sa sobrang overwhelmed tayo with all of the responsibilities that come, especially under your department, perhaps as we transition towards having a department specialized on this, we can do more of the trade, industrial policy, more of the strategic cooperation thing that we can pursue with rising powers like Saudi Arabia, Emiratis, Qataris, among others.
Most definitely, because the idea of the president and of Philippine policy in general is to make migration more of a choice and not a necessity. In other words, we don't envision that this migration phenomenon is something that has to happen permanently, that will always be a provider of labor to other countries, because even a lot of the countries where there are a lot of OFWs now were themselves labor sending countries. Before you just mentioned South Korea. But what about in Europe? I mean, there's a lot of Filipinos in Italy, in Spain, and those countries sent a lot of workers
to the United States,
to Latin America, or to richer northern countries in Europe, such as Germany, Luxembourg, Switzerland. And what happened is that eventually they developed to the extent that they now receive foreign workers. So in the Philippine case, eventually we could use our migrants as also cultural and economic ambassadors, because there's a lot of projects always been pursued by the DOT, DTI, wherein a lot of times even our kababayans or OFWs are encouraged to, for example, invite their amo to the Philippines under a special tourism program. And our migrants will not only be a source of remittances, they could be much more. And
cultural capital.
And as for the Philippines potential in these countries, yes, it's there. And in the way that they redefine themselves, for example, I'm telling you, as a sportsman, I never imagined people like Cristiano Ronaldo or Neymar playing in the Saudi League, or Qatar hosting the World Cup.
I didn't too.
Yes, but there you go. And so can we. They could redefine themselves. We could do that. We should do that. And that, I believe, is something we're all positioned to attain, following the right policies.
No, I think
we discuss a little bit of the big picture, and we'll go back to that later on. I mean, the Middle East, we keep on mentioning the Middle East. I mean, if the Americans concerned the Middle East is their military and strategic entanglements, for us, it's the fact that we have millions of our citizens there. Let's talk first about what's happening right now, and then let's look at also some of the other big developments in the region that really forced us to mobilize en masse, which is the Arab Spring a decade ago. But let's first start with what's happening right now, this latest round. And people keep on talking about conflict as if this is the first time this kind of conflict has been happening. So what's going on in Israel and in Gaza in particular? And are there also Filipinos in West Bank, for instance, on the other side, who are also looking for repatriation? What is the overall picture right now, Ambassador,
Yes.
as of November 6th, perhaps? Yeah.
As of November 6th, that will be Monday. All right, so as of November 6th, what was happening was that there was no border crossing. I mean, we had a
You mean the Rafah border
the Rafah
with
border
Egypt?
with
Yeah.
Egypt. We have 134 or 135 Filipino nationals still in Gaza. Now, when I say there are 135 Filipino nationals in Gaza, they're not. A lot of them are not like the De La Cruz, Gonzalez,
Right.
Filipino Malay-looking Filipinos. A lot of them are actually second-generation Filipinos, meaning
Oh, they've been staying there for a long time.
mestizos, kids
Yeah,
of
yeah.
Filipino mothers with their Palestinian husbands. And because wherever they're born, because their mom is Filipino, they carry Filipino citizenship. And then some of them grew up already because they were born in the 90s.
Yeah.
And they themselves have kids. So these kids who are the grandchildren of the original
I
Filipino
see.
are also Filipino citizens. So there's about 22 to 24 families there. And what's happening is that not all of them have decided to leave, partly because as Palestinians, they also are of that ethnicity that they feel that is their home. Of course, the government has been trying to
Yeah.
convince all Filipino nationals to evacuate. So the situation, as of you said, November 6th.
November 6th,
Okay,
because it's a
that's-
fast developing situation.
Well,
Things could change every day. Yeah.
The border was closed, and Israel had given assurances to the Philippines that we would be put as a priority. And yes, but they did not at that time promise that their Palestinian spouses would be given approval to leave. And that is the reason why it's been difficult to convince everybody, because some of the Filipino women who are married to Palestinians would rather remain. And this is not a new phenomenon. It
course,
happened in
yeah.
Ukraine. In Ukraine,
Oh, right,
a lot of the
yeah.
Filipino women remain in Ukraine because obviously the husbands could not leave Ukraine.
They had to fight the
they had
wars,
to fight
yeah,
the war.
yeah.
So, however, we're telling our kababayans, well, just go to the Philippines, and when this is true,
Things stabilized.
you can, things stabilize, you can go back. And of course, there's still this never-ending discussions brokered by countries in the region between Israel, Egypt, and Hamas about who goes in, who goes out, what goes in, what goes out, because the Israelis, of course, naturally would not want Hamas, militants, members of Hamas, to leave Gaza, nor would Egypt want it to be flooded with refugees.
Yeah.
If you remember in 1979, when the Israelis and Egyptians signed the
peace accords,
the peace accords, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and they offered the Gaza Strip, and Egypt said no. So so now the Gaza Strip is one of two elements of the state of Palestine.
Yeah.
The other is what you mentioned, is the West Bank,
West Bank, yeah.
which is between Israel and Jordan.
Jordan, yeah.
There are 125 Filipinos
In
there.
West Bank.
Yes, including some OFWs who, not migrants, but some, about 20 plus OFWs who did not actually get deployed to the West Bank, but to other countries in the region, and for some reason eventually decided to work in the West Bank.
I mean, like Jordan,
Yes,
Lebanon, or
Jordan,
Israel. yeah.
and maybe their employers brought them there, so
Right.
forth. So their situation is really more stable than the situation in Gaza, which is at
Yeah.
war.
There's no
It's
Hamas in
a-
West Bank. I mean, just for people who are,
Yes, The West Bank is where the government of the
Palestinian Authority,
the
yeah.
Palestinian Authority is located, and of course the Palestinians are in the West Bank are, while not being members of Hamas, we would understand why they would be sympathetic to the people of Gaza because of the Israeli actions. Nevertheless, it hasn't ballooned to a situation wherein we have to repatriate Filipinos from the West Bank. But if so, it can be done because they could go through the Jordan crossing into Jordan. Where
Yes,
it would be
much easier in the
much
West
easier.
Bank
In fact,
situation,
at the beginning of the war, so to speak, after October 7, after the horrendous October 7 assault by the Hamas on Israel, there were still tourists, some tourists, religious tourists in Israel. And because of the paucity of flights home, they had to go through the West Bank and through Jordan
right.
to
Land
go
border.
home.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
And our embassy in Amman, which is in Jordan, but also has jurisdiction over our relationship with the Palestinians and
Right.
also with the Filipinos, taking care of the Filipinos in the West Bank and Gaza, was able to help them. So that is
Because
not-
I understand the religious trip is like Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, right? Like
Yes.
that's usually the three countries they go to. So probably going to Jordan wasn't too difficult because that was already processed as part of the package. Can you give us a little bit of idea of the logistics situation? Like, if you want to help the Filipinos in Gaza, who are you really talking to? Because obviously it's an quote unquote occupied territory, right? In legal terms. So you talk to Egypt and Israel at the same time. Like, how does that
Yes,
work?
our people in Israel. So it's three embassies working together.
Yeah, it must be
Ambassador Pedro
complicated.
Lailo in
Yeah.
Tel Aviv, Ambassador Wilfredo Santos in Amman, and Ambassador Zidin Tago in Cairo. And Ambassador Fred Santos and his team in particular have to be commended for their
Yeah, it's,
work in communicating with each and every family
Yeah.
in the West Bank to make sure about their whereabouts or about their conditions. Now, how do we help them? We can't go in. It's under a blockade. We can't even send assistance. But we work through international organizations. There are UN organizations, agencies working there
Right.
distributing food and other supplies. However, our kababayans there are saying it's more and more difficult because you have to line up for hours to get sufficient food. There's a paucity of potable water. And medical supplies are there, but of course...
I mean, I heard like it went from 500 trucks a day of supplies to like 30 trucks.
Yes.
You know, in recent weeks. I mean, that, and it was already bad before. I mean, based on the numbers we're seeing
Yes,
now, it's
but
on the brink. Yeah.
Yes, but our kababayans are resilient because, you know, they chose all this time to live in Gaza, which since 2006 has been run by the Hamas, and there's always been blockades by the state of Israel. You know, when
Multiple rounds of conflict,
multiple rounds of
2021,
conflicts,
yeah.
except nothing like this.
Yeah.
And of course, it's misleading to say that Gaza is occupied because the Israelis already withdrew from Gaza in 2005.
But in terms of control
But
of
what they
water
meant-
and
yes.
electricity,
That's it. When they say it's occupied, what is happening is that it's still Israel which controls which goes in or goes out. So they are not
in conjunction with Egypt, right?
Yes.
Just to be clear about
So
it.
they're not completely independent. So
Yeah.
in that sense, although the state of Palestine is recognized as a non-observer state in the United Nations, so it's a complicated affair.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the logistics. Of course, I mean, it's a long conversation. The Fatah-Hamas divide, and of course, Fatah is really the Palestinian Authority right now. Now, let's rewind a little bit. Let's go back to the October 7 attack. You know, these heinous attacks led to the death of many Asians. I mean, more than 30 Thai. The Thai foreign minister, I think, was in Doha, also in Tehran. They have many hostages also still held in Gaza. I heard more than 50 by some counts. They're optimistic that things are moving in that direction. I think Nepal also had a lot of casualties and all. Now, obviously, we'll go to the UN vote later on because they voted a bit differently from us in terms of the ceasefire situation proposal. But in the case of the Philippines, again, how many Filipinos lost their lives during those attacks against civilians, heinous attacks, and are there hostages? What is the situation compared to, let's say, Thailand, our neighbor, who's really scrambling around right now?
Well, there were 4 who were confirmed dead, who were confirmed killed, and we commiserate with their families.
Yes, of course.
In fact, the Israeli ambassadors commiserate with their families, and the remains of 4 have arrived in the Philippines and been buried, including cremated remains. And the Israelis, true to their law and the word, have been providing what is required in Israeli law
Right.
as assistance, and so has the Philippine government through various agencies.
Right.
It's an all-of-government approach. 4 we are certain of, and there are still 2 missing, and we are going
Two
by
missing,
by the assumption that they are
Held
hostages,
hostage.
also Hamas. The alternate would be worse. That would mean that they are among those who were killed. In the eruption of
Unidentified.
27. There are still a lot of unidentified
Mm.
bodies in Israel.
Because of the, it was like so violent that they're,
Yes, they were so,
the physiognomy was,
Yes,
yeah.
and the Israelis have the DNA of the 2 missing persons through their relatives,
still have to go through.
and
the,
they're going through. We hope it comes out negative, and at the same
Yes.
time, they are aware. We have told them. I've personally told Ambassador Ilan Flus that the Philippines is concerned. While we recognize the right of self-defense, of course, there's the issue of international humanitarian law and the civilian
Yes.
casualties, but also how are the IDF's operations going to affect the hostages? Because there's always the risk that the hostages would be killed in these
In the strikes,
operations,
the
in
airstrikes and all, yeah.
because of they were supposed to be under the tunnels. And how are they going to rescue them? And what we are told is that the IDF has a strategy, and they can't really, obviously, for obvious reasons, share it,
Of course, yeah.
what's happening, but that they fully intend to rescue all, including our 2 kababayans, assuming that they are among the hostages.
Yeah, God willing, they're okay. I mean,
Enough.
they're alive to begin with. Yeah, because I was just trying to compare, because in Thailand, there's really a frantic effort by their foreign ministry to go around, talk to everyone to
Well,
deal
what
with the
happened?
hostages issues. Yeah.
We have a different situation because the Thais, and it's been like this since
Yeah,
the
could you explain?
90s.
Because a lot of Thais are working also in the agriculture sector in the southern Israel. So what's
Yes.
the?
What's happening is, if you know Israel, our kababayans are mostly in the cities, big or small. They're mostly in Tel Aviv, in Haifa in the north, in Jerusalem, and in some other places where they're mostly caregivers for elder people, including some who are survivors of the Holocaust. There are some hotel workers as well, but there are no agricultural workers.
In the kibbutz, for instance, right? The
Well,
Thai.
if the Filipinos in the kibbutz are also caregivers for people staying in the kibbutz, and that's what happened to the 4
Who were victimized, yeah. Yeah.
Now, with Thailand, a lot of them are agricultural workers
yeah.
in the south, near Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and that's why there was a bigger body
Casualty,
count among the
yeah.
Thais
Horrible,
because
yeah.
they were there, and so now the Israelis are saying that now they're going to have a positive agricultural workers as well, and in fact they've indicated maybe one day the Filipinos could also expand our participation in the Israeli labor force and send agricultural workers. But no, this is up to the DMW, of course, and the
Yeah,
president. But that explains why there were a lot of
Thai
Thais,
casualties, but-
including hostages.
Hostages. So
Yes.
50 plus hostages,
Yes.
31 I think were among the casualties. So most Filipinos are in Haifa, Tel Aviv, the biggest city. So perhaps that explains why the situation is different with Thailand, because I think Philippines and Thailand have similar numbers there. Like we have 30,000
They have
officially.
similar numbers,
yeah.
but they
Yeah.
have very few caregivers.
The configuration is
Completely different. And of course, there aren't that many embassies. I served in Israel. My first assignment as a junior diplomat was as third secretary and vice consul in Tel Aviv from 1996 to 1999. And naturally, I gravitated towards our ASEAN colleagues, but there was only the Thai embassy. Myanmar had an embassy.
Right.
And let me see now.
obviously not Malaysia, not Indonesia.
Not Malaysia,
you know,
Indonesia,
yeah,
not
of course,
Brunei.
yeah.
I think we were the only 3 ASEAN countries with embassies
That's
there.
my understanding.
So, so the Thais always had workers in the agricultural sector, never in
Ever
the cities.
since.
Never in the
Yeah.
cities. So that explains, and we of course sympathize with our
Of course.
ASEAN colleagues.
Yeah. And now, let's go to the UN vote. I mean, you're not the United Nations ambassador of the Philippines, but I mean, you're part of the DFA. The thing is, Nepal, Thailand, even France. I mean, I think France and Thailand had the two highest count among. But they voted for ceasefire along with 120 other countries. I think Pope Francis is also calling for ceasefire. Bernie Sanders, Representative Khanna. So I think there's more and more voices, including the West, including the U.S., calling for ceasefire. Why didn't the Philippines support the ceasefire? Why was abstention, in your opinion, in your judgment, the best course of action for the Philippines under current conditions?
Well, first of all, it's not that we don't support a peaceful resolution quickly and hopefully some cessation of hostilities, certainly an end to civilian killings. We mentioned that in an after the war
So in
speech.
principle, we are okay.
We are all right
yeah.
with the ideas presented, not all of them, but most of them, especially about humanitarian assistance and especially about following international humanitarian law. What was the situation, Mr. Adarian? There was a Canadian version of the resolution,
Right.
which was not the one put up for a vote. The Canadian resolution specifically had a provision mentioning the October 7 attack by the Hamas on Israel, which cost a lot of lives. And without that provision, the resolution, in our mind, would look like it was just, making it appear that everything here occurred because Israel is in the Gaza. Israel took its...
Like a trigger was not mentioned.
yes.
Right, yeah.
And let's remember, first and foremost, we care about our overseas nationals. True. 4 Filipinos were killed by the Hamas. For us to approve a resolution which doesn't even mention that October 7 attack, which resulted in the death of Filipinos, would be to dishonor the name of our kababayans, because they were also attacked. There is a mention in the version, the Jordanian version, which came out. Which
This final version that was voted upon is the Arab-led edition, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And it does mention the loss of Israeli and Palestinian lives. So, there's foreign lives also which got lost. So it would have been better to have included mention of October 7. And if it had been, we would have voted for it. Second reason is, of course, the Commander-in-Chief is the President of the Philippines. And the President already indicated our support for Israel and his understanding of the Israeli right to self-defense, and that this attack should be condemned. So for us to say that and then suddenly to vote for a resolution such as that one would be inconsistent. We show that we sort of a schizophrenic policy maybe. We have to be consistent with our words, otherwise no country is going to trust us.
Well, the counter argument I hear to that is kind of like, I mean, look at France, it's also a NATO member. They stood also by Israel and Macron earlier statements, and yet they said the humanitarian situation is just so dire. I mean, how many more thousand children, you want casualties before we call for this? So the idea was, we understand that we have to be, the statement has to take the relevant facts into consideration, but the humanitarian situation was urgent enough for us not to debate about the politics. And in fact, I think one of the arguments I heard from the other side is the language was neutral enough so that we can minimize the political finger pointing, so that we can focus on the humanitarian side. I'm just trying to also bring that aspect, as much as I understand where the Philippines comes from. Now, which brings me to this bigger question, right? So I spent some time in Singapore, Malaysia, some of our ASEAN countries over the past weeks or so, and then of course Europe also. So I've been trying to compare the voting patterns and all. So obviously we know what's the situation in Malaysia and Indonesia, have strong feelings in favor of Palestine. In the case of the Philippines, you usually hear that, the Philippines votes once again along or similar to the United States, that we're more Western in terms of our voting patterns. Look at the United Nations votes on Ukraine. I think there were 3 relevant resolutions we voted along. And by the way, this is not a criticism per se. I think on the Ukraine issue, that was principled position by the Philippines. I mean, what is the real score here? Is the Philippines more with the so-called global south? Is there really a global south thing, or the Philippines has a principled position, a principled neutrality, which reflects our national interest, depending on what's the issue at hand? Yeah.
Let me clarify, and no Foreign Service officer would disagree with this. In fact, all Foreign Service officers would say this. When we take decisions, they're always with the national interest of the Philippines in mind. It's not a policy decision taken on behalf of foreign countries. In this respect, in response to your question about the Global South, most definitely we tend to vote more with the Global South. We are a member in the second committee, which handles economic and environmental issues, of the group of 77, developing nations.
G77.
And now they're not 77 nations. No? I mean, they're about 130, including China. And you will see that we're consistently voting on G77 because we are a member of G77. Furthermore, even in other votes, including the Israeli-Palestine conflict, no, we do tend to vote closer to what would be an ASEAN position. It's not Western countries dominating the way we vote. It is ASEAN and G77. There are times, because of our unique situation, just like in this case with Israel, wherein we did not vote together with ASEAN. However,
but we voted with India, right? Who also abstained.
Who also abstained.
Yeah.
Let me give an example. If we actually voted along U.S. lines all the time, then all these past years, we would have voted no to these pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli resolutions. There are a number of countries who consistently vote no, aside from the United States. Not the Philippines. I mean, if you look at votes, for example, in economic resolutions, financing for development, the votes about the environment, Rio Plus 20 and so forth, usually the what you call the whale, the Western Europe and other countries, developed countries, vote a certain way, but the Philippines, along with other southern countries, third world countries, developing countries, vote another way. That is kind of a myth. In fact, let me use that word.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
it's a myth that we vote always with the U.S. You'll be surprised. And after all, in the UN, and I was also a deputy permanent representative to the UN in New York, you will see that if you look at the percentages, a lot of times we vote with the US because these resolutions are by consensus. Like practically 180 would vote for them. And therefore, even with this resolution on Israel, the 120 positive votes, 45 is a fairly large number of abstentions. 14 voted
India,
no.
right?
Yes.
Pretty big country.
Voted no. Ideally, a resolution in the UN General Assembly should pass overwhelmingly or not even be subjected to a vote because it passed by consensus.
I think the Cuba embargo, 180 countries were voted against it, except U.S. and Israel against, and Ukraine the only abstention, right?
I mean, if we wanted to show that we're only voting by the U.S., then we would have voted.
Or at least abstain. At least abstain. Yeah.
So that's a myth. That's a myth that we vote. It's a very popular argument among, those who are
dismissive of the Philippines.
Dismissive of the Philippines or anti-U.S., of a certain ideology that would think that the Philippines is some sort of puppet of the West.
So, Ambassador, do you think we're misunderstood also by our some of our ASEAN counterparts? I tend to hear this a lot. I mean, not only from quote-unquote leftists in the Philippines, but also from some of our neighbors in the region, that they just feel sometimes, I mean, on Ukraine, actually, personally, I feel that was very principled voting in favor of Ukraine, considering the horrible situation there. And it's not our fault if you don't want to take a principled position, right? But I just felt that there's always that tendency, right, to highlight that the Philippines is more aligned in general with the West, not necessarily the U.S., but it could be European vote, the Western Europe vote, rather than Asia. But as an academic, I've seen actually rundowns by numbers, and in fact, the Philippines was not as much aligned to the West as you correctly mentioned out. If you look at it empirically,
We're far closer to ASEAN.
Yeah.
We're far closer in voting along ASEAN lines.
so therefore, perhaps we should step up our public diplomacy and clarify this reality, because this is, I think, myth, right? That perhaps doesn't help, right, in terms of building
No, it doesn't
solidarity
help.
with ASEAN.
Well, that's where somebody like Mr. Haydarian is of great help. When you say
or not
this,
doing the other.
and,
Yeah.
and also, well, possibly this is also a myth which is spread by by critics, and
Right.
actually it's also a sign of the democratic tradition of the Philippines.
Of course, yeah.
We could shut them out. Actually, no, we won't. I mean, the fact is there. Look at the voting pattern. We're not actually one of those countries which the U.S. would rely on. There are a few of them in the UN to vote along U.S. lines. No,
Right.
no. We're not.
We're not a
those
vote
countries.
bank.
We're not a vote bank,
I
so to
think
speak.
that's the term.
We're
Yeah,
not
yeah.
a vote bank.
Yeah.
And of course, those other countries would have their reasons to vote yes or abstain or no, and we respect the sovereignty of all nations.
You are a career diplomat,
Yes.
So that means you have served in multiple administration. Now, I do agree with you that empirically, if you look at longitudinal study over the past 50 years, that I completely agree with you in terms of our voting patterns. It's not Western Europe or the West, etc. But some would say, like during the Duterte administration, for instance, we may have had votes on certain issues that was kind of outside our traditional positioning, because let's say the previous administration had its own concerns with international organizations like ICC, etc. Have you seen, have you seen consistency more or less in the Philippines positioning with slight up and down here?
Well, you mentioned Ukraine. Even though Duterte went to Russia, even during his presidency, we
Twice,
did vote.
yeah,
We did
yeah.
vote for the Ukraine resolution. So
That's an interesting one. Yeah.
that's a sign. And we still voted for resolutions which were pro-South. Actually, it wasn't in the UN voting pattern where you saw the shift in policy. It was in our declarations, more than the UN voting pattern. We didn't suddenly start voting in a completely different way simply because of the different approach of Duterte. And I'd like to
Prerogatives of the
say,
executive,
yes,
yeah.
the Europeans have a what they call l'alternance,
Right.
l'alternancia. Sometimes it's good to have changing positions, changing governments. Certainly, I served in Brussels.
In Belgium,
In
yeah,
Belgium,
exactly, yeah.
It was quite challenging to serve as ambassador to the European Union
At that time,
with President Duterte. But you could see the value of trying different approaches. And then if it doesn't work, try another approach, And certainly President Duterte brought another approach. So it didn't really mean that much difference in terms of actual tangible results, because our foreign policy is consistent. It's about protecting our national territorial integrity. It's about promoting economic interests and protecting our overseas Filipinos.
Yeah.
And also the policies are there in the Constitution. Right to self-determination, national interest, and so forth. So, it's just a matter of the strategies to be implemented.
Interesting you said that, because we also had Ambassador Romualdez on this show, and we were discussing the U.S.-China dynamic, and his contention also was, of course, he has served both under Duterte and also under the current administration, that there was an element of a shock there in the Duterte administration that perhaps made the Americans realize you cannot take the Philippines for granted. I mean, my views on this in terms of how to calibrate that shock perhaps is not something everyone can agree with, but I see where you're coming from. But you serve as our ambassador in Brussels during a very contentious time. I made many visits also to you during that time. I understand things were quite tough, perhaps even,
Yes.
to put it mildly, right?
Yes.
But do you feel that now the Philippines is taking even more seriously, that we're kind of in a sweet spot, strategic sweet spot? You know, like we're respected as one of the major democracies outside the West, but at the same time a country that thinks on its own. Because this is what I hear from Indians, so from our Indian counterparts.
I'll tell you,
yeah.
to answer you, most definitely. Because when I was a junior officer in the 90s, the impression they had of the Philippines, and they always had, you know, good things to say, good relations with the Philippines. But the impression, especially of first world nations, of the Philippines was that, we just, you know, we're a country which would look for labor markets or mendicants, meaning asking for aid. But now, no. The way they look at us is definitely they respect our growing economy. They respect our large market. They look at us as a dynamic force within ASEAN. They look at our position as a defender of migration with great interest, because it is a big issue now in the world, migration and migration governance with the Global Compact. Definitely, it's different. For example, you mentioned my term as ambassador to the EU, to Brussels, to Belgium, to Luxembourg, and the European Union. Despite their criticism of the foreign policies or the policies of our former president, they did not actually reduce our GSP plus privileges.
Although they threatened on many occasions,
but they did not, and that's because they knew of they needed our products, and they needed our market as well. I mean, so that's you know, it was important for them to maintain that.
And perhaps they had faith in the foundations of Philippine democracy to hold through, you know, let's say, quote-unquote, turbulent times.
So we are on a sweet spot, and President Marcos is following his line of foreign policy, of course, friends to all, enemies to none. But at the same time that he's doing that, you know, in a way, we could be benefited from the fact that the first world now looks at us as a country which will speak out, which will be ready to speak out. So now, when we talk about our concerns in our part of the world, about the rule of law, freedom of navigation, they do know that the Philippines speaks loudly.
There's more panache, pizzazz.
More
in
panache,
that,
more pizzazz. They respect certainly us. You were mentioning the ASEAN misunderstanding of the Philippines. Well, let's face it, we are quite a unique country. I mean, we stick like a sore thumb in ASEAN. I remember this British Spanish historian, Felipe Fernandez de Ernesto. He kind of reminded me of Humberto Campo. He would write history books. Very interesting history, he says. And one of his books was about the Americas. And from all the way from Alaska to the south, you know, Patagonia, south of Argentina and Chile. And his argument was that despite the difference in cultures and, of course, the economic disparity and the way of life, they were clearly one world, you know, it was the new world. They were one. And his argument was the last extension of the Americas, up to where does it go? Does it go to Hawaii, up to Easter Island, which is technically part of Chile? What? He said it's up to the Philippines. Philippines is sort of like the Americas. And then the same fellow, the same historian, wrote a book about the European Renaissance, Europe. And he concluded that the last European Renaissance man, the last champion of the European Renaissance, was a Filipino named Dr. Jose Rizal.
Right.
So that's who we are.
That makes us unique. You don't see anything like that. I mean, especially in the late 19th century, there's no parallel in Southeast Asia. Of course, later on, you have leftists, the even more Islamist-oriented Southeast Asian, taking on Rizal as the Malayan hero. But the reality is that he was your quintessential enlightenment, no, ilustrado.
Well, I saw in Israel, in Belgium, certainly a lot of European Knights of Rizal, and I'm one myself, who were very, very passionate about Dr. Jose Rizal.
Right.
And that's another source. of pride for us. By the way, one thing I, as an ambassador, always have told our OFWs abroad, never to be embarrassed about your status as workers abroad, because when you're doing honest work, even if you're not, well, we have some skilled workers, okay, not all are household workers, but household workers is a noble, they get paid.
Yeah.
It's an honest profession. In Europe, whenever there are common crimes happening, the Europeans never say, oh, it's because there are too many Filipinos here. They refer to other groups, never Filipino. And also, I tell them, you are only following the footsteps of great Filipinos. So I asked them, sinong pinakabantog na OFW sa kaysaysayan ng Pilipinas? And some might say Flor Contemplacion.
That's a good way of putting
and they say, and only a few get it. Why not Dr. Jose Rizal? Wasn't he an OFW? He practiced medicine in Hong Kong, for example. He was an OFW.
And he was not privileged all the time. There were times he was living, by the string of his boots.
Juan Luna, who I mean, last time we met in Madrid recently.
I mean,
I've of
so
course,
I'm getting goosebumps. I mean, come on, this is emotional for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know that you speak Spanish well, eh?
Not as well as you, but I understand.
Yo estudié en España. I studied in Spain as well. But look, I've been to the Prado, the world famous museum in Madrid. Oh. But now they have some, they always change the displays. Of course, the Grecos, the Velázquez's, they'll always be there. But among other paintings they change. They have a Juan Luna painting in the Prado, La Muerte de Cleopatra.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
I saw that. Yeah.
So he's an OFW. He spent Marcelo del Pilar,
and Felix Hidalgo is also on this side.
Resurrección Felix Hidalgo. So
getting goosebumps again. I'm sorry about this.
I was at the National Museum, and I said I wish more Filipinos would visit the National Museum and see. My God, the Spoliarium and
God,
all that,
I know.
So
and the Battle of Lepanto,
the Battle of Lepanto in the Spanish Senate. I mean, there are various versions of the Batalla de Lepanto. For example, there are some great versions of the Batalla de Lepanto. Tintoretto, I think, painted Italian painter. But Luna is the one in the Spanish Senate, so it's quite an honor. So we are unique. I put it this way. I had a political science professor in the 80s tell me that, well, Filipinos we have a connection with everybody. We can get along with everybody. We have a link with everybody. Yeah. And then he explored we're Asians, we're somewhat Hispanic.
We have Muslim connection too. Yeah.
And then I thought, through the years, I expanded and said, God, that's right.
Yeah, linchpin state.
Why am I proud to serve as a Filipino diplomat? Well, one,
you can easily blend. I mean, I've seen you in action. Like you can easily go from French to Spanish, and it's weird, right? I mean, I felt as much home in España than maybe at least in California, in US, etc. Right? I mean, the idea is for us Filipinos having affinity to America is normal, right? But you wouldn't think that in a European
country. Then let's put it this way, okay?
Yeah.
We're Filipinos, so we have an affinity, obviously, with Asians. We are Asians.
Yeah.
It's understated, our affinity with the Pacific Island states.
Right.
After all, we have they're much smaller in general than we are, but we have the same problem of climate change, of disappearing islands.
Yeah, Fiji.
And you might know that their origins were also in the
Melanesians.
That's why Austronesians, whatever, and that's why some of their words, like the numbers, are similar to numbers in the Philippines or in Indonesia. So, so we have the connection with Asians. We're a majority Christian country, but with an Islamic native population, Islamic as well. We have always had good relations with Israel, so we're connected to that. We have a big Chinese community, so the Buddhist culture is also part of that. The Hindu influence from
Manila, Nilad, which comes from Sanskrit.
From Sanskrit, and from the Vichipahit Empire, and so Guru, Mahal, I mean. And then, we mentioned the Hispanic culture. The reason why I said we are part of the Americas is that we are both Anglo-Saxon because of the U.S. influence and Latin, especially in Mexico. We created the first interoceanic trade route, or it was the first
globalization started as Gaian trade.
The Philippines, Acapulco, and Acapulco products arrived in Spain, arrived in Peru,
China.
So we have a connection in South America that way, not just Central America, not just Mexico. Europe, obviously. Africa, we are colored peoples, former colonies, so we had that common experience. Eastern Europe, well, different from Western Europe, but we're all new countries, new democracies after the late 80s. I mean, and look at the Philippines. We're talking about new democracies. Our president is serving under the Constitution of the Philippines, which was created after a revolution which removed his own father. Now, that is a democracy. That is the Republic of the Philippines. And we're proud to serve it.
On that note, bueno, muchas gracias, Ambassador. That was really, I really enjoyed it. I think we have to have a complete, I wanted to ask you actually more about Philippine, Latin America and all of that, but I think we have exhausted because we had to cover a lot, no? And I hope I didn't ask too many questions because, you know, this is the full breadth of the Philippine foreign policy. Thank you so much, Undersecretary and Ambassador de Vega, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk to our friends at Department of Foreign Affairs, and our best wishes and support also as you continue your efforts to protect the Filipino people all around the world.
Muchas gracias. C'est un droit très noble, des responsabilités très noble. It's a noble job that we're doing it, and also it's a pleasure that you allowed me to explain why we undertook these policies and why we're proud to serve our people. I'll end this way. Our Filipino kababayans, all Filipinos, but also our kababayans abroad, are heroes. Israel honors our kababayans there, including those who died for their heroic actions. So it can only be expected that the Philippine Foreign Service and other government officers will also be heroic in our service for them. And we will be. Mabuhay Pilipinas.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Pleasure. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcast. I'm Richard Hidarian, and that was The View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time. Thank you very much.